Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The unseen struggles. Leona Dorson had always known that nursing was more than just a job, it was a calling. But as she stood outside the massive Vora Medical Institute that morning, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. It wasn't her first day at the bustling hospital, but the large, sterile building always seemed to hold an air of mystery, as if it had countless untold stories waiting to unfold. Today, those stories would find their way into her life in a way she could never have imagined. The early morning sky was painted with hues of lavender and orange, and a cool breeze tousled Leona's neatly tied brown hair. The bustling parking lot was filled with nurses, doctors, and hospital staff making their way into the building, each person absorbed in their own routine. Leona felt a pang of nervous excitement in her chest. Today was going to be another busy shift, and while she was used to the fast-paced world of healthcare, she was still relatively new to this environment. At 25 years old, she had been working as a nurse for just over 2 years, but Vora Medical Institute was a different kind of place. The hospital was known for its large, diverse patient population, high patient turnover, and a constant stream of medical emergencies. It was enough to make even the most experienced nurses feel a little off balance. With a steadying breath, Leona made her way into the hospital. The moment she stepped through the front doors, the familiar hum of hospital life surrounded her, people hurrying in every direction, the crisp sound of footsteps on polished floors, the sharp smell of antiseptic in the air. Despite the chaos, there was a method to the madness, and Leona was ready to dive into it. She headed toward the locker room, where she quickly changed into her red nursing uniform. As she looked into the mirror, she couldn't help but feel a sense of resolve. This was her job. This was where she belonged. Her reflection stared back at her, young, but with the eyes of someone who had seen too much, who had learned early on that caring for others meant more than just following medical protocols. It meant being present, understanding, and often, having the strength to navigate the emotional weight that came with each patient. "All right, let's do this," she muttered to herself before leaving the locker room. She walked briskly down the corridors, her mind already switching gears into nurse mode. She wasn't just here to administer medications and monitor vitals, she was here to make a difference, even if it was just in small ways. Leona's shift for the day would bring her to room 412. The head nurse handed her the patient's file as she approached the station. "Clara Reynolds," the head nurse said with a soft smile. 86 years old, recovering from a heart attack. Stable, but requires regular monitoring and assistance. Leona nodded, scanning the file. She couldn't help but feel a connection to her patients, especially the elderly ones. She understood that often, when someone reached the later years of their life, they found themselves at the mercy of others, and that was when they needed the most care, not just physically, but emotionally as well. Walking down the long hallway, Leona's thoughts briefly drifted to the patients she had cared for in the past. Some had recovered, some hadn't. But what stuck with her were the moments when she had seen fear in a patient's eyes, or when she had noticed a quiet longing for connection. Those moments weren't as easy to forget as the medical charts or the diagnosis. When she finally arrived at room 412, she paused for a moment before gently knocking on the door. The room was dimly lit, a quiet hum of machines filling the background. As she entered, her eyes landed on Clara Reynolds, the elderly woman she had been assigned to care for. Clara lay in the hospital bed, her frail body enveloped by the sterile sheets. Her skin, though weathered by age, still held a soft glow. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she attempted to adjust herself, and her eyes, though tired, held a spark of something deeper, an old soul, Leona thought. "Good morning, Mrs. Reynolds," Leona greeted, her voice warm and soft as she moved toward the bedside. "How are you feeling today?" Clara looked up, her face lighting up with a small but genuine smile. "Oh, bless your heart, dear. I'm doing all right. Just tired of being stuck in this bed." Leona could see the weariness in Clara's eyes, but there was also something else there, an air of strength that Leona admired. She helped Clara adjust her position in bed, making her more comfortable, and then checked her vitals. As she did, Clara spoke in her gentle, raspy voice. "You know, dear, some of the nurses here are so rushed. But you take your time. It's like you really see me." The words struck Leona deeply. She wasn't sure if Clara even realized how much they meant. It was so easy in a place like Vora to become just another face in the crowd, another patient to be attended to in a never-ending cycle of procedures and checkups. But Clara's words reminded her why she had chosen this path, to be there for her patients, to show them kindness and compassion, and to never forget that each one of them was a person with their own story. As Leona administered Clara's morning medication and adjusted the drip of her fore, she couldn't help but notice how much the elderly woman seemed to crave human interaction. She asked Leona questions, not about her health, but about her life, where she was from, what kind of music she liked, if she had any hobbies. It was clear that Clara wasn't just interested in small talk, she was longing for connection, for someone to truly listen to her, to see her not as just another patient in a hospital gown but as a person who had lived a full life. Leona found herself telling Clara a little about her own life, how she had decided to become a nurse after watching her mother care for her grandmother in her final years, how her own grandmother had instilled in her a sense of compassion and duty. It felt good to share these personal details, especially with someone who truly seemed to care. As the morning wore on, Leona completed her rounds, checking in on other patients and administering medication as needed. But her thoughts kept returning to Clara. There was something about the elderly woman's quiet strength that stayed with her. It was as though, beneath the surface of frailty, there was a deeper resilience, a story waiting to be told. But as the hours passed, Leona began to notice something that unsettled her. It wasn't just Clara's fatigue or her physical condition, there was something more. As Leona helped Clara change her soiled gown, she noticed a faint, but distinct, yellow stain on the fabric. It wasn't just any stain, it had a peculiar, acrid smell to it, something that didn't quite belong in a hospital room. At first, Leona dismissed it as a simple accident. Hospitals, after all, were places where people were often too ill to control their bodily functions. But as she looked more closely, she noticed that Clara's hands were trembling even more than usual. Her eyes, which had been bright with curiosity earlier, were now downcast, avoiding Leona's gaze. Clara's behavior had shifted, and Leona couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. Before Leona could ask Clara any questions, the patient quickly changed the subject, asking if she could rest for a while. Leona hesitated but nodded, deciding to give her some space. She didn't want to push, but her instincts were telling her that there was more to Clara's condition than what was on the chart. As Leona left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. What had Clara been hiding? And what was it about the yellow stains and strange smell that seemed to linger in the air? Leona didn't know it yet, but what she had just uncovered would lead her down a path of unexpected discovery, and soon, she would be facing a moral dilemma that would challenge everything she thought she knew about healthcare, and about human compassion, the unraveling truth. The day stretched on in typical hospital fashion, chaotic, fast-paced, and relentless. But for Leona, her mind kept drifting back to Clara Reynolds, and the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of the elderly woman's downcast eyes and trembling hands replayed in her mind. Despite her professional composure, Leona couldn't shake the feeling that Clara was hiding something that went far beyond the routine medical care she was receiving. As the hours passed, Leona went through the motions of her nursing duties, but the events of that morning kept weighing on her. She checked on her other patients, administered medications, and made sure that vital signs were stable, but it was Clara's room 412, that kept calling her attention. The strange smell, the yellow stains, and the sudden change in Clara's behavior were all warning signs, but Leona wasn't sure what they meant, or even if she should do anything about it. She didn't want to jump to conclusions. After all, Clara was elderly, and the body often betrayed people in ways that were difficult to predict. Leona's shift was nearing its end when she returned to room 412. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows in the hospital halls, but the soft, cold light from Clara's room illuminated the space around her. Leona took a deep breath, bracing herself. She had already decided that she would try to speak with Clara again. She needed to understand what was going on. When she entered, Clara was sitting up in bed, her frail hands resting in her lap. The yellow stain from earlier was still visible on the edge of her hospital gown, but there was no trace of the odor now. Clara looked up at Leona, her eyes softening when she saw the nurse approach. "Hello again, dear," Clara greeted her, her voice still hoarse but warm. "You're back already?" Leona smiled, but the concern in her eyes was undeniable. "I just wanted to check on you, Mrs. Reynolds," she replied, pulling a chair closer to the bed. She sat down gently, trying to be as unobtrusive as possible, yet all the while, she was observing Clara with a level of scrutiny she hadn't applied before. "How are you feeling?" Leona asked, her tone light but searching. Clara hesitated for a moment, looking away. Leona noticed that her hands were trembling again. There was something different in Clara's gaze, something guarded, like a woman hiding a painful truth. Leona couldn't put her finger on it, but she knew Clara wasn't being entirely forthcoming. "I'm fine, dear," Clara answered, her voice wavering slightly. "Just tired. You know how it is." Leona's instinct told her that there was more to this than tiredness. She leaned in slightly, her voice soft but insistent. "Mrs. Reynolds, if there's something bothering you, something that's not quite right, I need you to tell me. It's important." Clara looked up, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. For a moment, Leona thought she might say something, but instead, Clara's eyes darted nervously toward the window, as if looking for a way out of the conversation. Leona could feel the tension in the room, thick and heavy, like an invisible wall that had suddenly gone up between them. "I'm afraid I don't understand, dear," Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's nothing wrong with me that you haven't already taken care of." Leona's gut twisted. Clara's words didn't match the truth that Leona could feel deep in her bones. Something was very wrong, and Leona knew she couldn't just walk away from this. "Clara," she said gently, "I noticed the yellow stains earlier today, and the smell. I know this might be difficult, but I think it's important we talk about it." At this, Clara's expression shifted dramatically. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, as though trying to shield herself from the world. The fear in her eyes was palpable, and Leona's heart ached for her. What was it that Clara was so afraid of? Why couldn't she just open up? "I didn't mean to make a mess," Clara muttered, her voice cracking. It's just hard sometimes. The medications, the condition of my body, everything's changing so fast. I can't control it. I'm sorry." Leona's brow furrowed. There was something in Clara's words, something that didn't add up. Messes in the hospital were common, but Clara was speaking as though the stains and odor weren't just a physical issue. She was speaking as if they were a symptom of something much deeper. "You don't need to apologize, Clara," Leona said, her voice softening. "We all go through changes, especially at your age. But it's important that I understand what's going on, especially with your medications. If you're feeling different, if something's wrong, I need to know." For the first time, Clara looked at Leona with something resembling trust in her eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there. She seemed to weigh her options, and then, as if making a decision she couldn't take back, Clara spoke. "I've been here a while," she began slowly, her voice tinged with sadness. "But they don't listen to me. They just keep changing my medication. Nothing seems to help. And I can feel it. Inside me. I feel weaker, more tired, but they say it's just part of getting old. It's not just my heart anymore, dear. It's everything else. I've been asking for help, but no one seems to care." Leona felt a lump form in her throat as she processed Clara's words. This wasn't just about a few physical symptoms, this was about neglect. Clara wasn't just being ignored as an elderly patient, she was being dismissed. Clara continued, her voice growing more faint. "I've been here for over a month, and no one really looks at me. They just come in, do their thing, and leave. There's no one who sees me, really sees me. I'm just another number to them. Leona's heart broke. She had known that healthcare wasn't perfect, but to hear it from Clara, someone who had spent her life serving others, perhaps now finding herself invisible in a hospital room, was a bitter pill to swallow. I'm sorry, Mrs. Reynolds, Leona whispered. I promise I'll make sure you're heard. You deserve more than just a quick check-in. Clara gave her a weak smile, but there was a sadness in it, too. I don't want to cause trouble, dear. I know you're trying to help. But sometimes it feels like it's too late. Leona sat in silence for a long moment, unsure of what to say. But one thing was clear, Clara's condition wasn't just a result of aging or heart failure. It was the result of a system that had failed to care for her in the way she deserved. And Leona knew that if she didn't take action, Clara's situation could spiral into something even worse. As she stood up to leave, she made a silent vow to herself. She wasn't going to let Clara slip through the cracks. She would do everything in her power to ensure that Clara's voice was heard, no matter the consequences. Leona walked to the nurse's station, her mind racing. She had to speak to the head nurse. She had to make sure that Clara's concerns were addressed. But as she walked past the busy ward, the weight of the task ahead of her felt like a heavy burden. It wasn't just about giving Clara the medical care she needed, it was about fighting for her dignity, fighting for her right to be seen as more than just another patient. Little did Leona know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she knew about the medical system, and about herself. A nurse's fight for justice. The next day, Leona's heart was heavy as she entered Vora Medical Institute for another shift. Her conversation with Clara had stayed with her all night, replaying in her mind over and over again. The promises she made to the elderly woman echoed in her thoughts, a constant reminder of the responsibility she now felt to take action. Clara was a patient among many at Vora, but to Leona she had become more than that. She was a person, with a life, with experiences, and with a story that deserved to be heard. As Leona walked down the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallways toward room 412, she felt a wave of unease wash over her. Her first priority, as always, was to provide her patient with the best care possible, but this time it was different. It wasn't just about routine monitoring or administering medication, it was about standing up for Clara, and by extension, standing up for all the patients whose voices were being drowned out by the fast-paced, impersonal nature of the hospital system. When she reached Clara's room, she found the elderly woman awake, looking out the window. The faint light of dawn filtered through the blinds, casting a soft glow over Clara's face. She looked fragile but peaceful in that moment, and for the first time, Leona saw the depths of the woman's soul reflected in her eyes. Clara was a survivor, a woman who had lived through hardships far beyond what Leona could imagine, yet here she was, enduring the indifference of the very system that was supposed to help her. Leona knocked gently on the doorframe. Clara turned her head, and their eyes met, both women understanding the weight of what was happening. "Good morning, Mrs. Reynolds," Leona said, her voice tender but resolute. "How are you feeling today?" Clara smiled faintly, but there was a weariness in her expression. "I'm all right, dear. Just tired." Leona moved closer, pulling up a chair to Clara's bedside. "I wanted to talk to you about something," she said, lowering her voice. "I took your concerns seriously yesterday. I've already spoken to the head nurse about your care. I'm going to make sure you get the attention you deserve." Clara's eyes widened in surprise, and for the first time since their initial conversation, a flicker of hope crossed her face. She reached out with trembling hands, taking Leona's hand in hers. "You'll help me, won't you? I'm so tired of being ignored." Leona squeezed her hand gently, nodding. "You don't deserve to be treated like this, Clara. No one should. I promise you, I'll do everything I can to make sure you're taken seriously. You matter." Clara's tears welled up, and for a moment, neither woman said anything. They simply sat together in that shared silence, a moment of connection that transcended the sterile walls of the hospital room. But as Leona sat there, a sense of urgency began to take hold. Clara wasn't the only one who had been neglected. Leona had worked in hospitals long enough to know that patients like Clara, elderly, vulnerable, and easily overlooked, were often swept aside in favor of more high-profile cases. The system, which was supposed to heal, had become a machine that churned through people without compassion or empathy. Clara's plight was not an isolated incident, and Leona knew that if she didn't speak out, no one else would. Determined to make a change, Leona went straight to the head nurse, Rachel Harper. Rachel had been at Vora for over 20 years and had seen it all. She was sharp, efficient, and, on the surface, appeared to be the ideal nurse for the job. But as Leona approached her in the bustling nurses' station, she wasn't sure what to expect. Would Rachel listen to her concerns, or would she dismiss them as the ramblings of an overzealous young nurse? "Rachel," Leona began, her voice calm but firm. "I need to talk to you about a patient. Clara Reynolds in room 412. Rachel looked up, raising an eyebrow. "What's the issue?" Leona took a deep breath before continuing. "She's been complaining about the way her care has been handled. Yesterday, she told me she feels like no one's listening to her. She mentioned that her medications keep changing, and she feels weaker and more tired. I've noticed some signs of neglect, yellow stains on her gown, an unpleasant odor, but what's worse is that no one seems to be paying attention to her needs." Rachel's face hardened, and Leona could tell that the older nurse wasn't particularly receptive to her concerns. "Look, Leona, I understand your concern, but we're short-staffed. We're doing the best we can. Clara's old, and her heart isn't what it used to be. She's just tired, like a lot of our patients." Leona's jaw tightened, but she refused to back down. "That's not good enough, Rachel. Clara's not just a tired old woman. She's a person who's asking for help. She deserves more than to be dismissed as a statistic. I'm not going to stand by and watch this continue." Rachel let out a sigh, clearly irritated. "We don't have time for personal stories, Leona. We have a job to do." But Leona's eyes burned with resolve. She wasn't about to let Rachel's dismissive attitude dictate the care Clara, and other patients like her, received. She had made a promise to Clara, and she would keep it, no matter the cost. "I'm going to escalate this, Rachel," Leona said, her voice steady. "I'll report this to the higher-ups. I don't care if it's inconvenient. Clara's dignity matters. Every patient's dignity matters." For the first time, Rachel hesitated, then nodded slowly, her arms crossed over her chest. "Fine. Do what you have to do. But don't come crying to me when it blows back on you." Leona didn't flinch. She was ready for whatever backlash might come her way. She couldn't allow fear of retaliation to stop her from doing what was right. That afternoon, Leona filed a formal report about Clara's treatment. She outlined the signs of neglect, Clara's accounts of her experiences, and her own observations as a nurse. It wasn't an easy decision. Leona knew it might put her job at risk, but she had come to realize that her role as a nurse wasn't just about caring for people in the moment. It was about standing up for them when they couldn't stand up for themselves. The following day, Leona was summoned to meet with the hospital administration. It was a meeting she had anticipated but never truly expected to take place. As she entered the office, she was greeted by Dr. Jonathan Wallace, the hospital's chief administrator, and a few other members of the management team. Their expressions were stern, but there was no anger in their eyes, only curiosity. "Leona," Dr. Wallace said, his tone neutral. "We've reviewed your report regarding Mrs. Reynolds, and we'd like to understand your concerns better." Leona took a deep breath and sat down, looking each of them in the eye. "I'm concerned that Clara, like many other patients here, is being treated as just another case to be handled. She's been ignored, her needs dismissed, and no one has been listening to her. This is about more than medical care, it's about human dignity." Dr. Wallace leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in thought. "We appreciate your dedication, Leona. But you must understand, this hospital is understaffed. We have hundreds of patients to care for, and sometimes, things slip through the cracks." "I understand that," Leona replied firmly. "But that's not an excuse. When patients like Clara are ignored, it's not just a failure of the system, it's a failure of compassion. The system can always be fixed, but we have to start by treating people like people. The room was silent for a moment, and then Dr. Wallace nodded, slowly. You've made your point, Leona. We will investigate the matter further. I'll personally ensure that Clara's care is reviewed. Leona stood up, feeling a surge of relief, but also a quiet sense of triumph. She hadn't just fought for Clara, she had fought for all the voiceless patients who had been lost in the shuffle. The battle wasn't over, but it was a step in the right direction. As she walked out of the meeting, Leona felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just a nurse at Vora Medical Institute. She was a voice for the voiceless, a champion for the forgotten. And she wasn't about to let anyone, no matter how powerful, stand in the way of her mission. The ripple effect of courage. Days turned into weeks, and as Leona continued to care for Clara, the changes she had fought for slowly began to take shape. The administrative team at Vora Medical Institute had launched an investigation into the complaints, and while it wasn't an overnight transformation, Leona could see the slow but steady improvements in Clara's care. More nurses had been assigned to the ward, the patient-to-nurse ratio reduced, and Clara was receiving more consistent and personalized attention. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and it was a victory Leona wasn't ready to take for granted. One morning, as Leona entered Clara's room, she noticed something different. The room, which had always been dim and sterile, now felt more inviting. A small vase of fresh flowers sat on the bedside table, and a photo of Clara's family was placed carefully on the windowsill. The soft yellow light of the morning sun filled the space, creating a warmth that wasn't just physical, but emotional. Clara, who had once seemed distant and defeated, now appeared more vibrant, even in her frail state. Her eyes sparkled with gratitude, a smile playing on her lips as she looked at Leona. "Good morning, dear," Clara said softly. "I've been meaning to thank you, you know." Leona stopped in her tracks, surprised by the words. "Thank me for what, Clara?" "For seeing me," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "For not just looking at me as another patient to get through. For caring about me. I can feel it. I can feel the difference in the way I'm treated now. I haven't felt this alive in months." Leona's heart swelled, but there was also a knot in her chest. Clara's words hit her deeply, words that reflected the truth about the healthcare system that so many overlooked. Patients like Clara, with no visitors, no family to advocate for them, often slipped through the cracks. Yet, in that small act of compassion, a simple acknowledgement of her humanity, Leona had made all the difference. "You don't need to thank me, Clara," Leona said, brushing a stray hair from her face. "I'm just doing my job. You deserve to be treated with dignity. Everyone does." But Clara shook her head, slowly. "Not everyone sees it that way, dear. It's rare to find someone who truly cares, who doesn't just do what's required. You've given me something that's even more valuable than medicine. You've given me hope." Hope. The word resonated with Leona. In that moment, she realized that the work she had done wasn't just about treating wounds or administering medication. It was about providing something deeper, something more profound. She had given Clara hope when everything else around her felt like a cold, impersonal machine. It was the kind of hope that could heal wounds just as effectively as any pill or procedure could. As Leona continued her shifts, she began to feel a shift within herself. The frustration that had once clouded her heart was being replaced by a quiet, yet powerful determination. She had made a difference for Clara, but this wasn't just about one patient, it was about the systemic changes that needed to take place in hospitals everywhere. Clara had opened Leona's eyes to a larger truth: when we forget the humanity of the people we care for, we fail them. But when we remember their worth, everything changes. One afternoon, as Leona was walking through the hallway to check on her other patients, she was stopped by Rachel Harper, the head nurse who had initially been resistant to her concerns. Rachel was holding a clipboard, her usual stern expression softened with an unusual hint of respect. Leona, I just wanted to let you know that there's been some positive feedback about you, Rachel said, her tone almost warm. I've heard from several of the doctors and other nurses that you've been handling your patients with a lot more care and attention than before. Leona blinked, surprised by the acknowledgement. I'm just doing what needs to be done. Rachel nodded, her expression thoughtful. I know, but the way you've handled things with Clara, it's been impressive. You've got a way of making people feel heard. Maybe it's something I've missed in my own practice, but it's something I'm starting to understand. So, thank you for showing me that there's more to this job than just checking boxes. Leona's heart surged with a mixture of pride and humility. Thank you, Rachel. I didn't mean to step on anyone's toes, but when you see someone suffering and you know you can do something about it, well, you can't just walk away. Rachel gave a small smile, then turned to leave, but not before she added, You've got a lot of potential, Leona. Keep doing what you're doing. Leona watched her walk away, a sense of accomplishment washing over her. What had started as an isolated incident, her fight for Clara's dignity, had ripple effects, not only in the hospital's policies and care standards, but in the attitudes of the people around her. Leona had sparked a change, and while she knew it was only the beginning, she felt a profound sense of purpose. She had made her voice heard, and in doing so, had begun to shift the culture of the hospital, one patient, one nurse, one conversation at a time. The impact of her actions didn't stop there. Clara's health continued to improve, her heart stronger than it had been since her admission. But more than her physical recovery, it was the emotional and psychological healing that mattered most. Clara had found her voice again. Leona's advocacy had helped her rediscover the strength within herself to fight back against the system that had tried to ignore her. And as she grew stronger, Clara also became an advocate for herself, making sure her care was being handled properly and speaking up when she felt something was wrong. It wasn't long before Leona found herself becoming a beacon of change in the hospital, not just for Clara, but for others. Word of her dedication and compassion spread throughout Vora Medical Institute. Nurses and doctors alike began to approach her for advice on how to better engage with their patients, how to offer more than just clinical care. They asked her how to make their patients feel seen, heard, and cared for. Leona's simple act of standing up for one patient had turned into a movement, a quiet revolution of care, humanity, and respect. Leona's passion for nursing, which had once been clouded by doubt and frustration, was now clearer than ever. She understood that the job was more than just performing medical tasks. It was about making a difference in people's lives, no matter how small or large. In Clara's case, it was a difference that had saved a life, not in the traditional sense, but in the most important way. It had restored her sense of worth, her dignity, and her ability to believe in herself again. Leona's journey didn't end with Clara, though. The lessons she had learned, the courage she had found, and the voices she had fought for would stay with her forever. She realized that every patient had a story, a battle, and a need to be seen and understood. In her work, she would always be reminded of the power of empathy, and how it could change everything. Every patient, regardless of age, race, or condition, deserved to be treated with the respect they were entitled to, and she would be there, every day, to make sure that happened. And with that, Leona found herself more than just a nurse. She was a warrior for justice, a beacon of light in a system that too often forgot the humanity behind the charts and medications. She had found her calling, not just to heal bodies, but to heal spirits. And that, she knew, was the truest form of care.